Thanks for asking.
Hi, we are going to go ahead and start. My name is Carol Masterson. I am a South Portland mother of 2 small children and a volunteer with Protect South Portland. We are here today to make sure people are not misled by the oil industry's many false claims in its high-priced campaign, as it attempts to mislead voters on its drive to export toxic tar sands oil from South Portland. The oil industry is planting seeds of fear throughout our community. Local people are being approached by someone paid by the oil industry and told that they should be fearful of the ordinance. In reality, it is the only thing we have to keep our community safe from tar sands. The oil industry is spreading misinformation throughout the community and in the media as a way to distract voters from what is really going on, which is that out-of-state oil companies want to build incinerators and smokestacks in South Portland so it can export toxic tar sands oil. These big oil companies will do and say anything to attack the Waterfront Protection Ordinance, which stands in the way of their tar sands project. Today, we'd like to make it very clear to voters just what's going on with this campaign. Number 1, the fact is the Waterfront Protection Ordinance protects all existing waterfront businesses. It protects all oil companies to continue existing operations and to maintain, repair, and upgrade those operations. The Waterfront Protection Ordinance does the one thing it is meant to do. It prevents the oil industry from building a tar sands export terminal. Number 2, big oil companies are trying to mislead voters with a phony study. The oil industry paid $15,000 for the study, which is based on an imaginary scenario. No matter how much money the industry has to plaster ads in newspapers and online, its claims are still 100% false. Number 3, Portland Pipeline Corporation already has the permit it needs from the state to build their tar sands export terminal in South Portland. The company extended their permit until February of 2014. Number 4, Portland Pipeline Corporation, the real interest behind the opposition, is not a locally owned business. Exxon owns the controlling interest of Portland Pipeline. These big oil companies, which are heavily invested in tar sands operations, do not care about the South Portland community. What they care about is exporting tar sands oil. Number 5, this is a David versus Goliath battle. On one side, there are thousands of concerned citizens like me volunteering our time to protect the city and pass the Waterfront Protection Ordinance. On the other side are big oil interests with unlimited resources willing to do and say anything to push through their tar sands project. I would first like to introduce Dave Owen, South Portland resident and professor of law at the University of Maine School of Law. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you. Thank you for coming today. So I'm speaking today in hopes of clarifying 2 points that have become a little bit confused in the debates surrounding the Waterfront Protection Ordinance. And the first point is that the Waterfront Protection Ordinance really is the only available response to a clear and present threat to South Portland. And that threat, of course, is the proposal to develop a tar sands export facility in South Portland. The second point is that the scare stories about the Waterfront Protection Ordinance are overblown. If it passes, and I hope it will, the Waterfront Protection Ordinance will prevent the development of a tar sands facility in South Portland. But that's it. All of the other businesses can and will continue to thrive. So first, since the Waterfront Protection Ordinance has emerged, there have been some rumors and some rumblings that there isn't really a proposal to build this terminal, that it doesn't respond to a present threat. And of course, none of us know what Portland Pipeline's and ExxonMobil's exact plans are. Those are discussed at closed-door meetings to which the people of South Portland are not invited. But we do know their words, and we do know their actions. And so first off, the words have included doing things or saying things like telling Vermont legislators that the company was aggressively hoping to pursue a tar sands project. And the actions have, first off, included renewing a state air quality permit specifically for a tar sands project. And so you can see the cover letter for the permit right there. This is an active state permit that the company already has for this project. They wouldn't do that if they weren't thinking about moving forward. And then more generally, the parent companies of Portland Pipeline continue to work very aggressively to get as much tar sands oil out of Canada as they can, and are looking all over the continent for a place to bring that oil to a port and to the world market. And so they are very, very serious about this, and we can expect that they will extend that effort into South Portland. In fact, they already are. So that means that the tar sands project presents a very real and very present threat. And if the Waterfront Protection Ordinance doesn't pass, South Portland really has no defense against that threat. Portland Pipeline has already sought a permit from the city of South Portland. It sought it a couple of years ago, and that permit has since expired. When it sought that permit, the city basically said that its hands were tied, that there was nothing the city could do but grant the permit. And law in the city has not changed. The only defense that the city would have against having its hands similarly tied again is to pass the Waterfront Protection Ordinance. Without it, it would simply have to grant the permit again, and our community's ability to have a say in this part of our future would be gone. So what about the collateral effects of passing the ordinance? The opponents have produced a study that provides some fairly scary economic projections. But again, it's important to understand that that study starts with the premise that this ordinance will shut down all petroleum businesses, not future businesses, existing businesses along the waterfront, and that will do a lot of collateral damage to other businesses as well. The study makes no attempt at all to justify that premise. The author is very careful to say he's not saying that would happen. All he is saying is that if it happened, then these would be the collateral consequences. But it's a fictitious assumption. It's based, and I think the best explanation comes from the attorney letter sent by a couple of attorneys in town that explains how the Waterfront Protection Ordinance actually protects existing businesses. It grandfathers in businesses that are operating already. It applies only to exports or new large-scale petroleum export facilities. And so that means that businesses that exist will be able to continue on. Those that depend on clean water will have more protection than they have now. And the other important thing to consider is that the ordinance is going to be implemented by city staff. And this city has a long and I think very positive history of working constructively with its businesses. And we fully expect that that history will continue, that that culture of cooperation will continue, and it will continue with our full support. All of us who stand here before you, we have no desire to shut down existing businesses along the waterfront. We have no desire to prevent the industrial waterfront, the working waterfront, from thriving. All we want to do is stop a tar sands export facility from being built in our community. And the Waterfront Protection Ordinance is our best shot at doing that. So in sum, the evidence is striking. The pipeline company really does intend to pursue a tar sands facility in our city, and that fits everything we know about the oil industry players involved here and their goals and their interests and the things they're doing across the continent. And it also helps explain why they would produce such an intense and such a distracting effort to try to raise smokescreens about the real issues in this campaign. So rather than be confused by these actions, South Portland residents should see them for what they are, as an effort to promote tar sands in this city, and should stop that by voting for the Waterfront Protection Ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave. We want to protect South Portland's existing waterfront. Out-of-state companies want to transform it with their extreme tar sands oil export project. The oil industry tries to hide the fact that Portland Pipeline Corporation is a corporate subsidiary owned by Exxon, not a local business. To illustrate who is really in charge, consider the pipeline company's 10-person board of directors. 7 of the 10 employees of Canadian oil companies that have a direct interest in exporting tar sands. 2 other directors are with Shell Pipeline in Texas. Only 1 director has a position at Portland Pipeline Corporation, and that person, CEO Larry Wilson, is also the CEO of a Canadian pipeline company, Montreal Pipeline Limited. These big oil companies do not care about the South Portland community. What they care about is exporting tar sands. Exxon is the largest oil company in the world with $45 billion in profits last year, and certainly does not have our interests in mind. What they do have is a history of environmental recklessness and drive for profits at any cost. The oil corporations that are behind the No on WPO campaign are not local, and they are not looking out for the best interests of South Portland. No matter which spokespeople they pay to come to our press conferences or knock on doors, these big oil corporations, including Exxon, are the real players opposing the Waterfront Protection Ordinance. The powerful oil industry has a long history of waging misinformation campaigns and environmental recklessness. Now we're seeing it here in South Portland. The oil industry is not looking out for our best interests, the best interests of our businesses or our future. They want to bring tar sands to South Portland, no matter what the cost is to our community. These big oil companies have a lot of money to throw around to oppose the Waterfront Protection Ordinance and advance their tar sands interest. Just today, it was reported that the oil industry has outspent us citizens 10-1. Keep an eye out for the slick flyers, high-paid consultants, robocalls to your home. Ask the canvasser who comes to your door whether they are getting paid. Do they really think they can give out free soccer balls to kids at Wainwright Field in order to block the Waterfront Protection Ordinance? They have enough money to flood your web pages with campaign ads that lie about jobs impacts, but they are still lies aimed to advance their tar sands interests. The citizens of South Portland are standing up to protect ourselves and our community. We have had more than 260 volunteers, spending more than 850 hours talking to our neighbors. We have knocked on more than 5,300 doors and made nearly 3,000 phone calls. This was all done by volunteers like me. As we're out in the community, 3 out of 4 people we talk to support the Waterfront Protection Ordinance. Our community has really come together around protecting ourselves from this tar sands project. Now I would like to introduce Bob Klotz, who is speaking for our mayor, Tom Blake, who has lost his voice.
Okay. Tom said he would sign language me. I got that one. I'm Bob Klotz. I'm a private citizen in South Portland. It's an honor and a privilege to be able to speak on behalf of Mayor Blake. So this is the statement of South Portland Mayor Tom Blake. My name is Tom Blake. I am mayor and a lifelong resident of South Portland. South Portland residents have the opportunity to vote for the Waterfront Protection Ordinance to keep our city's waterfront as it is, so children can continue to play at Bug Light Park and marinas, restaurants, and homes can continue to share the shore with industrial facilities. But the oil industry is spreading false and misleading information in an attempt to scare and confuse voters, diverting attention from this crucial decision for our community. What this vote is really about is protecting our community. The Waterfront Protection Ordinance prevents the oil industry from building a tar sands export terminal while protecting all existing waterfront operations. As your mayor and a father of 4, grandfather of 13, impressive, and my 26-year background as a firefighter paramedic, the health and safety of our citizens is always first on our mind. South Portland has charted a course for a sustainable, prosperous future with a healthy working waterfront and compatible mixed uses that take advantage of one of our strongest assets, our gorgeous coastline. The tar sands project would bring 2 new 70-foot smokestacks next to Bug Light Park, tons of additional toxic air pollution, and tankers carrying tar sands out of Casco Bay. This would not only increase the risk of a major spill in the bay with more environmentally damaging tar sands oil, it would also threaten city residents, including children, with toxic air pollution, breathing problems, and even cancer. These sizable smokestacks next to Bug Light Park are needed to burn off toxic polluting chemicals as the tar sands is loaded onto tankers. The structures would emit dangerous pollutants known as VOCs, or volatile organic compounds. VOCs contribute to more smog, which can trigger asthma attacks as well as breathing and cardiovascular problems. The Portland Pipeline Corporation is already the #1 source of VOCs in South Portland. These new smokestacks would significantly increase this dangerous source of air pollution. In addition, the smokestacks would be highly visible from some of the most scenic coastal spots, including Bug Light Park, Willard Beach, Southern Maine Community College, and the Portland Waterfront. The smokestacks would harm the scenic beauty of our South Portland coastline. As our community has evolved, we have made investments in our schools, community center, and athletic fields right here in the heart of the city. The Portland Pipeline Corporation's tanks next to our schools have been empty for some time, but if filled, would hold 133 million gallons of oil. If oil companies are allowed to build their South Portland tar sands project and these tanks are filled with tar sands oil, we may well see cancer-causing benzene and other toxic chemicals polluting the air right next to South Portland schools. These tanks currently emit 82 tons of air pollution per year, but if the tar sands project goes forward, they would emit as much as 220 tons every year, nearly tripling the amount of toxic air pollution where our children learn and play. We have never had tar sands oil in these tanks before, and we know it would be more dangerous to our child's health than conventional crude oil. This tar sands project is not consistent with a healthy, safe, and prosperous community, and is not consistent with what I believe South Portland people want for their community. This spring, Dee and I were in Arkansas shortly after they began suffering the disastrous consequences of the latest largest scale tar sands oil spill. Hundreds of thousands of gallons of tar sands oil spilled out into suburban neighborhoods and nearby waterways in Mayflower. The similarities between Mayflower and South Portland are incredible. A 60-year-old pipeline owned by ExxonMobil, built to carry oil, but now carrying tar sands oil. From the locals we talked to and the stories we read to the gloomy pictures we saw, I feel certain that this is not what we want for South Portland. We cannot stand by and let South Portland become another victim of the dangerous effects of tar sands oil. I am not willing to gamble my city's future on this just because big oil companies want to export tar sands. I'm taking a stand to protect our shoreland and our people. Just this March, the pipeline CEO told the South Portland City Council in a room full of 400 South Portland residents that they would love to start exporting tar sands through South Portland as soon as possible. Currently, there is nothing to protect South Portland from this dangerous project. As you have heard, the company already has a permit from the state. I am seeing the oil industry use false information and misrepresentations to intentionally confuse the voters. As an elected official, that really disturbs me, and I think it will disturb voters when they understand better who is really behind the opposition and why. The only thing South Portland can do to stop the tar sands project is passing the Waterfront Protection Ordinance in November. As a wide variety of powerful outside forces will be working to influence us, let us as South Portland residents do our own homework. Let us learn the facts of the issue, and let us, as a concerned and civil citizenry, make the right decision for South Portland. I fully support the Waterfront Protection Ordinance. If we don't pass the ordinance in November, we're going to have a tar sands project on our waterfront that will harm the air and water quality for our children, now and for generations to come. Tar sands will deflate our property values and damage the healthy economy of our city. Like thousands of my fellow South Portland residents, I will be voting for the Waterfront Protection Ordinance on November the 5th. As your mayor, I urge you to vote for the Waterfront Protection Ordinance on Tuesday, November the 5th. Thank you.
Bravo.
Never
Thank you so much, Tom, and thanks for reading, Bob. We will now take questions from the press.
Actually, I have a question for you, Mr. Mayor, if you don't mind stepping up to the... I'm not mimicking you. I'm feeling your pain.
Yeah.
I've asked this question before, and I've been covering this issue for months now. As it stands today, would there be permits needed to be garnered through City Hall before this project could be built? Because I hear that there's permits in place, but I'm confused on the issue, and I've been covering it for a while, so I can understand where this will continue.
Yes, there are two sets of permits. There are local permits and there are state permits. The process for the exportation of tar sands would be the same as it was in 2009, when Portland Pipeline came before our planning department and our planning board and did indeed receive approval. That was renewed for a one-year period, and that did expire. Nothing has changed since then. So Portland Pipeline, yes, would need to go through the permitting process, and as it was approved in 2009, I see no reason why it wouldn't be approved again. The Waterfront Protection Ordinance is our protection to prevent that.
Okay. So the state permit's in place. There's nothing on a municipal level at all currently.
That's correct. Nothing currently municipally. Yeah.
The other part of the opposition's message is that this is already stymieing upgrades, business, investment in the waterfront, in other non-related businesses and in related businesses. Do you feel that that is the truth? And have you heard that from business leaders in the community who say this is going to have an impact on non-tar sands related projects?
No business has ever approached me personally. The Waterfront Protection Ordinance strictly pertains to the petroleum businesses, and that is it. If an individual company, including the petroleum business, has decided not to process an application permit, that's on their own accord. They're doing that simply, in my opinion, to help their cause. But there's nothing currently in place that would prevent anybody from moving forward on any projects that they desire. Nothing in place. Just a quick comment. My voice problem is because of asthma. I have a very rare form of asthma, which I've had for 14 years, and I can't help but think some of that is spending 62 years in South Portland. My neighbor growing up was an oil tank, and I spent 27 years in the fire department. We know that asthma is one of the highest rates in the state of Maine, and I've always been very curious what our asthma rate is in South Portland. But I do know that I have a good case of asthma. Of my 2 of my 4 daughters and 5 of my 13 grandchildren all have asthma. So that's one reason that health and safety is always first and foremost in my mind. So answer your question okay?
Yes, thanks. Mine's a 15-month-old baby.
Okay.
So. Not asthma.
Other questions?
Yes, Carol, David Aaron, forecaster. This has been delineated here as an effort to stop big oil and outside ownership. But actually, the planning board, by a 4-2 vote, and at least 2 of 4 council candidates are clear in saying they believe that this is a waterfront protection ordinance that does conflict with the city comprehensive plan and is incompatible with essentially with development, and that includes Maxine Beecher, who is the author, essentially, or led the committee to create the new comprehensive plan. How then do you reaffirm the message, including the idea that this depends on reasonable application of the language?
Thank you. Dave, would you like to take that question?
So the initial answer is we strongly disagree with the conclusion. I mean, don't doubt the integrity of the people who drew that conclusion, but we strongly disagree with the conclusion that this is inconsistent with the general plan. What the general plan tries to do at its core is strike a real balance between maintaining industry, developing new development of mixed use that's consistent with quality of life, but also protecting the quality of life of the city. And bringing in a tar sands export terminal is not consistent with that balance. So why did it get that reaction from the planning board? I think it's important to understand that the planning board was under siege with constant, just a barrage of communication, a barrage of arguments from the oil companies who were parsing over the statute, or the proposed ordinance, pulling individual words or phrases out of context, and then using those words to predict that the sky would fall. And they were doing that not just directly to the council and not just directly to the planning board, but also going to other businesses up and down the waterfront and saying, if this passes, you are finished, and having their lawyers give the same sorts of presentations.
At least 2 of the 4 people on the planning board speaking about why they feel it's incompatible were very clear in their distinct and deep fears of tar sands being imported into the city, and still said this is incompatible. That would include Rob Schreider and would include the former chairman of the planning board, Molly Butler Bailey.
Mm-hmm. And again, the bottom line is we think that they are misreading the ordinance, and we think that they were strongly encouraged, very persistently and aggressively encouraged to misread the ordinance by a barrage of oil industry publicity. And when the ordinance goes into effect, we would be shocked if the city winds up, and shocked and disappointed, this is not what we want, but we would be shocked if the city winds up applying the ordinance in a way that starts shutting down existing businesses or preventing those existing businesses from doing the sort of maintenance and upkeep work and in many cases expansion work that if you look at the opening section of the ordinance, it really tries to preserve.
I wonder if I could take a stab at that also. A couple of things about the comprehensive plan. Shortly after the planning board meeting that evening, I did receive a communication from one of the planning board members telling me that it was perhaps the most difficult meeting they've ever attended. And they also made it real clear to me that they felt intimidated by the room full of high-priced attorneys representing the Petroleum Coalition. So, and watching the meeting, for a layperson representing our community on a volunteer board, I can see how easily that can happen, intimidation by high-priced attorneys. I served on the city's last comprehensive planning committee from 1988 from 1992. It was a 4-year commitment. One thing I quickly learned after the city adopted that comprehensive plan is that comprehensive plans statewide are not 100% Bibles. They are constantly in flux. And that's a problem that the city of South Portland made in 1992. The plan was never revisited on a regular basis. It was never tweaked. It had a variety of problems. And one thing that the council has done this time is that we are establishing an implementation committee to work with the comprehensive plan on a weekly, monthly, daily basis, to change it as time changes, to make additions, to make subtractions, to make tweaks. I serve on the steering committee for the Greater Portland Council of Governments, which deals with 28 different communities in comprehensive plans. There are very few communities that don't have differences of opinion, discrepancies, problems with their comprehensive plan. They are not 100% roadmaps. The comprehensive plan, and from my perspective, more clearly identifies the health and the safety of our community, the visual beauty of our shoreline. And that's what it encourages us to protect. That is clearly throughout the entire comprehensive plan. And in my opinion, the Waterfront Protection Ordinance does abide by the wishes of the comprehensive plan.
If there are no more questions, we will conclude this press conference. Thank you so much for coming.
These memories undoubtedly